You represent, I think, an interesting point of view where, on one hand, you told me, Will, I don't want unity with people who can't acknowledge the horrific nature of assassination, of murder. On the other, you also feel optimistic, a little bit like what I just heard from Eric Trump about the future of America.
Oh, very much so. I think what I'm delighted about is I think, first of all, there's a ceiling on how many people are going to have their eyes open ever, and that ceiling is quite low, and that's fine because they're not the ones making the decisions in terms of the populace. But I think there is an increasing understanding that the time for dialogue is over. I don't think President Trump, in the first term when he ran in 2015, 2016, he said, I'm a deal maker. I'm going to sit down with Pelosi and cut these deals. He's not saying that anymore. He understands the reality of the situation. So I think, one of my points I say is the best argument against gun control is gun proliferation. These people aren't arguing in good faith. There's no point in sitting down having a discussion because they're never going to say, oh, well, I lost that argument. You get to have your way. It's never a thing. Everything is always illegitimate that they're opposed to the point of advocating for violence for those who would pass laws or do things that they're duly elected to do. So I think this understanding that Ayn Rand had this great quote where she said, I'm not looking for honest disagreement. I'm looking for honest agreement. And I think there comes a time, and I think that time is long past, where this kind of bill bridging is of no utility because these people aren't negotiating good faith.
You had this great line yesterday off camera with me where you said, I think everybody pines for the 1980s. They pine for this moment when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would argue vigorously and then afterwards go hit the golf course. And now the fear is that the analogous Tip O'Neill would hit you over the head with his club.
That's right. Yeah. And it's scary, but I think people need to understand what they're up against. And I think something else we discussed is I think COVID was exposed a lot of the nature of who people are those who love freedom are up against. When you saw people advocating for kids being taken away from parents who didn't get their kids vaccinated, when you saw the Canadian truckers, I don't know if people realize this, when they had that convoy in Canada, the cops were saying we might take their children away from them. It's not safe for them over there, and the media cheered them on. So and the whole thing with giving kids sterilizing drugs and things of this nature, when you realize, and also normalizing predation upon children and just regarding it as just another lifestyle choice, when you realize what you're dealing with, these are things that you and I and everyone listening to this would have thought as unthinkable maybe 10, 11 years ago, and now it's in first grade. So I think there is an understanding of we've gone way too far and talking isn't going to get us back.
I think you're a great student of history, Michael. My question is not what we're dealing with on two levels. One, the basic struggle of human nature.
Sure.
And then on the deeper level, that struggle within human nature is a struggle of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm getting at is we're not actually in an aberration moment in history.
Right.
We are actually regressing to the norm. There have been moments in American history we were very capable of transcending that tribal, inherently violent, zero-sum game fight for power. That's the story of man.
Yeah, that's right.
Until fairly recently.
That's right. Well, I think people need to remember that one of my favorite founding fathers, and I'm sure yours, Patrick Henry, in 1765, before America existed, stood in the Virginia House of Burgesses, pointed at King George and said, I would remind King George that Caesar had his Brutus, King Charles had his Cromwell, and everyone starts yelling treason, treason. And he'd do well to profit from their example. If this be treason, make the most of it. So he was arguing for King George to meet the guillotine in 1765. So there's been a long history of this sense, but it was always regarded toward political figures when there's no other option, like the last resort. It was never this idea of Charlie Kirk, someone who's a political pundit. This is something that is unprecedented and new. No one was arguing for shooting H.L. Mencken or Walter Cronkite. And the cheering, I think the key to cheering, as we discussed a little bit yesterday, isn't just that they're cheering. It's not that people have these thoughts, that they're broadcasting them on TikTok, on social media, expecting and correctly expecting accolades for it instead of condemnation.
Let's be, you are a honest, self-aware truth teller. Let's be as charitable and as self-aware as possible. The gut instinct answer, it may be where we end up, but if a corollary of Charlie Kirk was assassinated on the left, Rachel Maddow? I'm just trying to think of...
Let's not even put a name, just somebody. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I can honestly say, this is my belief, and I'm trying with all self-awareness, yes, there would be some fringe elements. There would be. There always is. but I do not think you'd see this level of celebration of her or any left-wing commentator's death.
Well, I think I also would want to point out if Officer Harris had won this election and this had happened to Charlie Kirk, we'd be seeing a crackdown on free speech the likes we've never seen in this country. She would be talking to Facebook, and Elon wouldn't take her calls, but TikTok and all these other outlets, and they would be striking down so-called hate speech and violent speech, by which they mean anything that doesn't favor the administration. They were talking about this since Hillary ran in 2016. Tim Walz talked about this openly. There has been, in the same way that the Democrats wanted socialized health care since the days of Harry Truman, Bill Clinton tried to put it through, was that 40 years later. This has been for a couple of decades now, this idea of, it started even Fox News. The fact that even Fox News exists was some kind of existential horror to the left. It's still regarded as some kind of correctly enormous threat to the left. So they have been waiting for an excuse to do what they're doing in Canada and doing in England. And I was delighted to hear what you said, and I agree with you entirely, that for Pam Bondi to be walking into this trap is completely un-American and deranged to me, because then conservatives have learned that in the same way the Patriot Act was only against terrorists, and 5 minutes later the definition of a terrorist is someone who owns a gun, hate speech is very quickly going to be, as soon as there's a Democratic president, and there's going to be one, someone who that Democrat hates.
I have no idea what's going through the mind
Right?
of the Attorney General. I have no idea what's going through the mind of Pam Bondi. There is today, as many have pointed out, a legitimate investigation into the depths of this particular act of violence. Was it or was it not a singular, insane, hypnotized, acculturated, insane individual, or was it part of a larger network? And that's worthy of real law enforcement investigation and potential charges. I also believe there are limits to the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has drawn that line at direct incitement to violence.
Correct.
And I think we should be vigilant.
Yes.
I think in this very moment, there is people beginning to push that boundary.
Yes.
I think that I've played a clip, and I will play more in the coming moments. For example, from YouTube streamer Destiny, which I can't say is certainly a direct incitement to violence, but we're getting very close to direct incitements to violence, which would require government action against certain speech. But hate speech is entirely un-American.
It doesn't exist. It's like this concept of gun violence, whereas in all these countries, the gun laws, they're just stabbing each other and children are being assaulted by migrants. It's completely insane. It's completely un-American. And there's no precedent for it. Like, there's precedent for obscenity laws. There's precedent for sedition laws, which are obviously insane. But hate speech is an entirely university concept. And as people watching the show understand, the university is where the poisoning starts and where all the problems are coming from.
Let's stay on the note of information for just one moment. Look at this. This is really incredible, Michael. So this is polling that asks people, as far as you know, is the person who shot Charlie Kirk, and then the polling asks people to respond. Is Charlie Kirk a Democrat? 21% said yes. A Republican, 24% said yes. Not sure, 40%. But it gets worse.
Oh, wow.
Let me show you exactly how this breaks down. As far as you know, is the person who shot Charlie Kirk among Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. So is the person who shot Charlie Kirk a Democrat? Only 8% of Democrats believe that to be the case. Meanwhile, 40% of them think that he is a Republican. We've got a real problem with information.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the definition in their mind of a Republican is someone does something bad. So since he did something bad for some of them, therefore he's a Republican. It's also what we spoke about yesterday, the idea that anyone who is against you must be a Nazi. That Charlie, who is probably the most moderate of all these conservative pundits, was regarded as the most extreme, because there's such a frenzy in this anti-Trump dementia that it's kind of like everyone becomes indistinguishable. And we saw it. I mean, we live in a country where Mitt Romney was considered, some kind of radical jihadist. So, and people say this with a straight face. So it's like we're talking about earlier, there's no room for discourse with this. This not a fact-based scenario.
Okay, I want to come back to there's no room for discourse. I do want to pick up on something you said a moment ago. This stands out in American history. While the eternal battle for human nature is good and evil in each inside one of us, and the great accomplishment of the American experiment is to push us beyond those tribal instincts, you still see this as a unique moment because H.L. Mencken wasn't the target for assassination.
Right.
Charlie Kirk is not William McKinley. Charlie Kirk is not a president wherein we have seen political figures be assassinated. Charlie Kirk is a commentator sharing free speech, and we haven't seen that type of thing in the past. When you said that, it makes me sort of run through my Rolodex of history. I think you're much more well-versed than I am and able to pull off your fingertips examples of history. The best that I can come up with just off the top of my head, would be the French Revolution, where private citizens were hauled before the guillotine.
Right.
The Jacobins wanted a purity of their civilization.
That's right.
But that was largely drawn on the lines of elites and the common man. The common man, and quite honestly, the elites who felt out of elite circles,
That's right.
driving the common man to find their fellow elites to place on the guillotine.
Right.
I just want to try to find this moment in history that we live in today in the past, because I think it tells us something about our future.
I agree with you. First of all, the only example I can think of is Larry Flint. So Larry Flint was shot. They didn't kill him, but he was like a public figure in kind of roughly analogous, but obviously he's a pornographer, so there's nothing that Charlie would be in favor of. I think what's different is because of social media, everyone, for better or worse, has a platform to make their voice heard. So back in the day, if you were a fan of William McKinley, getting assassinated in Buffalo, you would have thought, okay, I can't say this out loud. I don't have a mechanism. There's no newspaper's going to print my article, and I'm going to feel alone. But now, thanks to social media, if I'm that person who has that rabid view, very quickly I'm part of a network where it's like, no, you're the sane one. Everyone else is crazy, and there's no counterpoint to that. So it becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think social media, for better or worse, and in this case clearly worse, is an enormous mechanism toward radicalizing people in every direction.